100 years later, instability in countries that once found themselves part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, Israel, Syria, and Iraq, remain one of the clearest legacies of the First World War. Joining us now to detail how the tensions and violence that mark the region today stem from that conflict a century ago, we welcome Thabit Abdullah. He's a professor of history at York University and the author of A Short History of Iraq. Welcome.
Thank you.
Can't imagine there's actually a short history of Iraq, but there you go. You've written a short book. We're going to talk about Iraq and other countries in the Middle East and about World War I. But I want to start by talking about the Ottoman Empire. So as I want to pull up a map of the Ottoman Empire, of the region in 1914. As war breaks out in Europe in 1914, what's the state of the Ottoman Empire at the time?
Well, the Ottoman Empire was quite an old empire. Its origins begin around 1300. Actually, the late medieval period. Its furthest extent reached deep into Europe, all the way up to Vienna. So that in the 17th century, the borders reached from Austria throughout the Black Sea. The Black Sea was basically a lake, an Ottoman lake, all of North Africa, into the Horn of Africa, into Eritrea, and the eastern border was basically Iraq. So it was one of the largest, probably at its height in the 16th century, it was probably the most powerful state in the world, especially in terms of its military. Now, by the 19th century, however, it was beginning to really break apart and witness major transformations. There's a big debate, was it undergoing an inevitable decline? You know, I tend to think so. I don't think the Ottoman Empire could have lasted, but it was certainly being transformed. And on the eve of the war, the Ottoman Empire began to adopt a very nationalist discourse. It began to emphasize its Turkish identity rather than its Islamic identity. It was also adopting many European-inspired reforms, such as legal reforms. There was a lot of secular legal reforms that were introduced, much industrialization, open markets for European investors, and so forth. So it was really being transformed.
And as it's going through this transformation, its military, what's the state of it?
Well, the nationalists in the Ottoman Empire, those that felt that the empire must reorganize itself on a nationalist basis, in order to create a more cohesive entity, emphasized the military as the engine for this, or the vehicle for this change. They felt that if you create a modern army imbued with a nationalist fervor, that could become the instrument for a strong, unified state.
Sounds familiar.
Yes, exactly. Many of the Middle Eastern countries adopted this model even after World War I. And in a way, they were being, I think they were rather successful in establishing stronger and stronger institutions in the country. On the eve of World War I, the empire felt that it was being torn in different directions. There was one group which felt that the empire should draw closer to England and France in terms of alliances. Another group which felt that Germany is their natural ally. Germany had never really had an inimical relationship with the Ottomans, unlike the French and the British. And a third group that counseled, complete neutrality and independence vis-a-vis the alliances that were going on.
So the empire chooses to side with Germany and Austria and Hungary. Why does it make that choice?
It makes the group, which was headed by a man called Enver Pacha. Now the war, begins in 1914 in Europe, and the Ottomans remain neutral for a couple of months. And there's an intense debate that's going on in the upper echelons of the empire. The argument that won the day was based on two fundamental points. One, the Germans had never attacked us. They had never, set their eyes on our territory. In fact, Germany had become a very important investor They were planning a massive railway project called the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, and it was, in the works. And they had very strong influence in the army. They were beginning to train the Ottoman army. The second argument is that even if we ally with the Allies, even if we ally with France, Britain, and Russia, Russia's going to attack us anyway. Russia was dead set on gaining territory at the expense of the Ottomans, and especially the entrance to the Black Sea, especially the so-called straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. They were very open about this throughout the decades preceding World War I, and the Ottomans felt that they had to ally with the Germans. Also, the Germans, of course, were winning at the beginning. I mean, it seemed like it was a good bet at the beginning of
and
the war.
On the other hand, other side, you have France, Russia, and Britain, the Allies. What are their aims at the time in the Middle East?
Long before the World War I, already the European powers were planning to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and divide it between themselves, essentially.
Well known, very obvious.
Oh, yeah. There was plenty of articles being written openly, speeches being made in parliament, etc., public speeches. The Ottoman Empire was referred to as the sick man of Europe, and that it was larger than its capacity. There was a very strong interest on the part of the French in the Levant, especially in the eastern Mediterranean coast, Lebanon, Palestine, and northern Syria. The British had a strong interest in the Persian Gulf area and what is today southern Iraq, Basra. And right at just before the beginning of the war, Britain took a very important strategic decision to transform their entire navy from dependence on coal to dependence on petroleum. And thus the petroleum fields became suddenly extremely important, very strategic. Now, nobody knew that Iraq was full of oil back then. They had suspicions. But Iran, just across the border, was already exporting petroleum. And it was British petroleum that was taking it out. So the British were very much interested in controlling southern Iraq to protect the oil fields and to protect their trade routes with India.
All right, so that's sort of how the geopolitical landscape looks like in 1914. So Ottomans on one side, the European powers, the Western European powers on the other. How much resistance do the Ottomans put up to the Brits?
Massive resistance. The Ottomans proved to be a very staunch foe. The Ottomans fought on 4 fronts simultaneously. I mean, there's a lot of talk about how difficult it was for Germany to fight on 2 fronts, on Russia, and France. The Ottomans fought on 4, and these were in the 4 corners of the empire. In the southeastern part, southern Iraq, the British launched an invasion. They actually sent the invasion force into the Persian Gulf even before the Ottomans had declared war on the Allies. So even before the Ottomans had joined the Central Powers, the British were already invested in this. So they invade Basra, and then they begin to march up the 2 rivers. One force goes up the Tigris, the other one goes up the Euphrates. The English at the beginning weren't really interested in much more than Basra. And it's extremely important to note that Iraq was not just created by the British coming and conquering. When the British entered into Basra, Iraqi elites from Baghdad and from other parts of the country, urged the English that if you're going to come in and take this part of the country, you might as well take the whole thing, because that's the only way we can create a viable state. And so they went north, and they met little resistance until about midway through the Tigris, in the city of Kut al-Amara, the British suffered one of their most humiliating defeats. The Ottomans surrounded the British army, and the British surrendered. General Townsend was the commanding officer, and it was a very humiliating defeat. The defeat was actually one reason why London decided to invest even more heavily in Iraq and turned the fortunes around, and they marched on, took Baghdad, and then reached all the way north around Mosul. Mosul was actually taken after the armistice, which was sort of an illegal occupation. So that was one front. The second was in the southwestern part of the empire, and this is Syria and Palestine. General Allenby took an expeditionary force from Egypt and went in, took Jerusalem and then Damascus. Now, the important thing about that is that a very important ally to the English was an Arab revolutionary force that came out of Mecca and Medina, actually, more importantly, and reached. It was led by Prince Faisal, the son,
Saudi Arabians.
Yes, yes, from the Hashemite family. They claimed to be descendants of the Prophet, and so they had this aura of respect. And they agreed with the English that they would join forces with them, declare a rebellion against the Ottomans, in return for having Britain help them in establishing a unified Arab kingdom. Now, the borders of this kingdom were not very clear, but it almost, it's pretty clear that it involved the Fertile Crescent, Iraq, Syria, and Arabia. Now, how much of that, which areas were excluded from that is debatable. But it's, the British certainly said that they would support a unified Arab kingdom, a large Arab kingdom. And Prince Faisal was very successful in entering Damascus, even before the English, and in establishing a government in which he was declared king. The English reneged on this promise, as they did throughout the war, and supported the French in taking Syria. And Prince Faisal had to go into exile, eventually ending up in Iraq. So that was the second front. The third front is probably the most famous in the West, and that's the front in Gallipoli. That was very close to Istanbul. This, of course, in the northwestern part of the country, where Winston Churchill devised this, master plan of a landing at the peninsula of Gallipoli, and then perhaps marching all the way to Istanbul and dismantling the Ottoman Empire. Much to their shock, the English, even though they invested about 500,000 men in this particular campaign, the Ottomans fought tooth and nail, and in a way they defeated them. I mean, the English had to abandon this whole campaign. About half of the British-led expeditionary force at Gallipoli suffered casualties. They were either killed or were wounded. And the hero of this battle was Mustafa Kemal, who would later become the very famous Ataturk, the founder of the Republic of Turkey. And the fourth front that they fought in is perhaps the most tragic, of course. This was in the northeastern part of the country, in eastern Anatolia, bordering Russia. This was the front versus Russia. Now, the Russians had, even before the war, used elements of the Armenian population there as an ally, and trained, militiamen to go into the Ottoman Empire as a way of trying to extend their influence in the region. This was a horrific battlefront because it was a seesaw battle. The Russians launched an offensive, the Ottomans drove it back, then the Russians came again, and then after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Ottomans launched a massive invasion reaching all the way to Baku, all the way to the Caspian Sea. Throughout this seesaw battle, there were massacres of civilians. When the Ottomans were on the move, Armenians and Assyrians and other Christians were massacred mercilessly.
This is the genocide.
Yes, there's this big debate, of course, about this. Was this a government, attempt to eradicate the full population, or were these just massacres that occurred during the heat of the battle? I'm not really prepared to
Let's
make
not go there, because we could do a whole show about that. Okay.
I can tell you though, and it's extremely important to note this, that at least as many Muslims were killed during these massacres as Armenians were. And this is, unfortunately, is an issue that is not discussed. I mean, the Armenian tragedy is one that rightfully should be discussed and emphasized and condemned, and Turkey today has a responsibility to what happened. But so too must we discuss what happened to the Muslims. I mean, the Turks, the Kurds, the Abkhazians, the Circassians, there were numerous peoples that the Russians evacuated in their millions probably, and many of them died in the hundreds of thousands. And there were also terrible massacres that were conducted by Armenian militiamen on civilians.
Okay, Thabit, we're getting away from that conversation because, as I said, we could talk about that for a half hour, an hour. Okay,
yes.
So eventually the British and the French signed this agreement. It's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. What does this agreement entail?
The English especially signed numerous secret treaties throughout the war with one purpose, and that is to win allies to defeat the Germans. Many of these secret agreements were contradictory, and they certainly could not have planned to keep all of them. The most painful, especially for the Arabs, is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It's a notorious agreement. This was an agreement signed primarily between the English and the French. In fact, the name of the agreement refers to the two chief negotiators, one from England, one from France. But it also included Russia and Italy. Essentially, it called for, now this treaty was signed in 1916, and essentially it called for a division of the Ottoman Empire after the war as essentially spoils between the victorious powers. The English would get what is today Iraq, Jordan, and Israel, or then referred to as Palestine. The French would get Syria, Greater Syria, Lebanon. The Russians would get a piece of Turkey, and the Italians too would get several islands in the Aegean. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin published these treaties and pulled out, of course, and then it became known, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It leaves an extremely bitter taste, and I remember, for example, as a schoolboy in Iraq, we spent a lot of time on the Sykes-Picot Agreement and how the colonial powers divided the Arabs in order to weaken them, and how these divisions still exist today.
And took no concerns of the local population at the time.
Yeah, you see, the hypocrisy here is that there was lip service given to self-determination. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was a major champion of the right of self-determination. But in fact, the only right that was actually exercised was the right of the victor.
Okay. A year later, in 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, which promises Jewish people a homeland. What's the calculation there in 1917 for the British?
The British, first of all, the Zionist organization, which was established in the late 19th century, was becoming better and better organized. At the beginning, it seemed almost like a pipe dream, the idea of creating a Jewish state as a solution for anti-Semitism. Most Jews, especially in Western Europe, thought this was a ridiculous notion. Why should anybody leave Europe to go, in this underdeveloped place, in the Middle East? But slowly it begins to gain traction. So there was a very strong lobbying effort on the part of the Zionist organization. From the British perspective, they felt that perhaps making such a declaration to the Jewish people in general would gain them strong support within Germany, because the Jewish element in Germany was very important in the war front. I mean, the Jews participated very loyally in the German army and in the bureaucracy of Germany, and they thought perhaps this would create at least some level of dissent within Germany. The declaration, and it is basically just a declaration, a letter which was sent to a very important individual in the Zionist organization, Lord Rothschild, who was also an important entrepreneur. Essentially, it says that the British government looks favorably upon the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. Typical of British diplomatic efforts, it can be interpreted in a million and one ways. You know, a Jewish homeland, not a Jewish state. In Palestine, not of Palestine, not of the whole place. The Zionist organization took this as a promise of the English to support them in the establishment of a state. The Arabs saw this as a terrible betrayal and yet another dagger in the back. Now, it's very important to note that at the time the Balfour Declaration was made, only about 10% of the population in Palestine was Jewish.
Okay, I want to bring up another map. This is, 1924, so we're out of the war. We're in the peaceful years. Here's a map of the Middle East. Now, talk to me, Thabit. 100 years later, here we are in 2014. Europe largely peaceful, for the most part, for decades, while instability still reigns in the Middle East. So when you look at that map, how much do you attribute to today's tensions of what happened a century ago? Because while you're talking, I'm like, wait a minute, we're still talking about that. But how much do you attribute the link between a century ago and today?
World War I, was essential in the creation of the modern world, especially in the modern Europe, but also so essential in the establishment of the modern Middle East, with all of its ills, with all of its problems. By the way, Europe did have to go through the trauma of World War II.
Sure.
And still, many traumas in Eastern Europe and so forth before it eventually sort of calmed down. We don't know. Eastern Europe is still...
That's why I said largely, largely a peace.
Yes. In the Middle East, the borders that came down were extremely traumatic. There were individual families that now had different citizenships. A very famous family in the Middle East called the Al-Hindi family, who were merchants. Some of them are Palestinians, some of them are now Lebanese, some are Syrians, and others are Iraqis. This was all a single family, all cousins and so forth, now carrying different citizenships.
And this is because the imperial powers came in and basically drew straight lines on maps.
Exactly. Now, some of these lines did reflect, old regions. For example, Mesopotamia did have a sense of an administrative and economic unity, but especially the division between Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, this practically never existed. So this was very traumatic. Secondly, the Middle East now was under either direct or indirect control of France and Britain after having promised to support independence. And this was seen as a betrayal. And also there was a lot of animosity to colonialism, as there was everywhere else in the Third World. You see, the English and French control is different, a little bit different from Ottoman control. In the sense, the Ottomans could claim that, we're Muslim, we represent, all of the Islamic peoples. Even then, it was facing a very strong Arab nationalist movement that was calling for secession. But now, under English and French control, the alienation between ruler and ruled became even more stark. And the individuals that the English and the French sort of patronized to come to the fore were never trusted. They were seen as traitors. So it created an element of instability.
And that mistrust lingers on today. We just have about a minute left, and I want to play a little bit of revisionist history here with you.
Yes.
Say Germany had won the war. How would the future of the Middle East look different than it is today?
Very, very different.
More stable?
I doubt it, because the problems in the Middle East, go well beyond this. But had Germany, won the war, and I'm not exactly sure what that means also, I think that the Ottoman Empire would have still ended, because there was already a very strong sense of nationalism now gripping the region. The Ottoman Empire was adopting the Turkish identity, which alienated the non-Turks. So the Arabs were already clamoring for independence. I think rather than French and English domination, the Middle East would have had to suffer from German domination, either direct or indirect. And again, some of these issues would have come to the fore. I don't know about the Arab-Israeli conflict. This might have taken a very different turn, though.
Thank you, because, the Middle East is often in the news, and I appreciate you, explaining it, seeing it through a lens of 100 years ago, because we rarely get a real history lesson in it. So thank you for explaining it to us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.